Hello and welcome. This is the Student Undergraduate Research Experience at the University of Saskatchewan, where we've put together a number of videos so check them out on our YouTube site. I'm Merle Massey. I'm the coordinator of undergraduate research here at the U of S. And with us today is Rebekah Bennetch, and she is from the Ron and Jane Graham School of Professional Development. It's over embedded in the College of Engineering, but Rebekah is a professional writer, and she's here to help us learn a little bit more about how to up our game, our writing game, and become just that little bit better. Thank you, Rebekah, for being with us today.
Hey, thanks, Merle. So the first thing I always do is I always make the desperate plea that if you're in a place where you don't mind showing me your bright, shining faces, if you could turn on your camera, that would be awesome. I know that not everyone's always in a place where you can have your cameras on, but this is going to be pretty laid back session. And so I do like to talk to the people that I'm giving a session for. So if you don't have your cameras on, I will be talking to you throughout this session. So this isn't one of these where you can just kind of absorb it. Like I'm going to put you to work, but we're going to have fun doing it. So I'm looking forward to getting to know all of you and to chatting with you for the next hour or so. And those of you that are watching via online, hello. Thanks for joining us too after the fact, and I hope that you'll find something useful from this video. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen real quick so you can see my slides. And I've already given to Merle the website for these slides, so you're free to access these. But you know what? I'll go ahead and put them in the chat now as an extra bonus for those of you who are joining us live. You can actually follow along with me. So I'm just going to put this in the chat real quick.
I can do that, Rebekah.
Oh, I did it. I already did.
Okay, I see that.
I'm fast. Awesome. I got two hands.
Ah, gosh.
Alrighty, so we're gonna get started. So as Merle said, my name is Rebekah, and I've been with the Ron and Jane Graham Center now since 2006. So I'm almost a fixture, it feels like. I've been in a part of this college, and it's the Ron and Jane Graham School of Professional Development in the College of Engineering. So as I said, I've been there since 2006, so quite a while. I have been teaching the course RCM 300. Now, I think I recognize some of your names who are here joining us today, because I think I taught some of y'all. So I'm going to be using the chat, so feel free to use the chat. But I think I recognize a couple of your names, either that or I recognize your name from last time I talked to the Sure folk. So good to see you. I've taught RCM 300 a lot. Last time I counted, it was over 70 times. So I've taught this course a lot, but I love this course. And a big part of this course is what we're going to be talking about today. And so what I'm hoping to today is by the end of our little session today, there's two things we're going to be talking about. The first is I'm going to give you what I like to call a rhetorical formula. So I don't have a one-size-fits-all strategy that can work in all situations, but I'm going to give you a set of tools. And so those of you that have taken RCM 300 before, if you're in the colleges of engineering or agriculture, then you might be familiar with that program. You will remember some of what we've talked about, because it'll be a bit of a review. But even if you haven't taken RCM 300, I'm really hoping that this will be useful for you. I'll give you some good ideas of things for you to think about when you're putting together your own talk, your own presentation. So whether it's for PowerPoint, whether it's a quick 5-minute chat you're having with a friend, whether it's an oral presentation, these are tools that are quite transferable, both professionally and personally. And then for the last bit of our chat here, we'll just talk about some strategies for dealing with nerves, because I know that's a big part of public speaking, is the nerves that go with it. So I'm hoping that I'll give you some good tools and strategies to kind of help you with that. Can I switch to presentation view? I can. Thank you, Merle. If I can remember how to do it. Here we go. Yeah. Presentation view. Perfect. All right. So first thing is, what does it take to communicate? So what I have here is a triangle, which is not news to you. You recognize that shape. But what we call this specifically is we call this the rhetorical triangle. So we're going to rewind our time back a few thousand years, and we're going to go back to Aristotle. And Aristotle came along, and he designed for us the tools of communication that he first called the rhetorical triangle. So rather than thinking of communication in a linear form, so we have a speaker with a message that gets given to a receiver, he thinks of it like a triangle. And what the power of a triangle is in its angles, right? And I'm not a mathematician by any means, but look at the different ways that these angles interact and intersect with each other. So when you look at the very top of the triangle here, the speaker, notice that the speaker is connected to two things, right? Now, of course, if I were to ask you before, you would say, oh, of course, the speaker is connected to the message. But notice that the speaker is also connected to the audience. And that's an important connection that oftentimes people forget about, is that when you're giving a presentation, it's not just what you're saying, but you also have to think about who you're communicating with. And that's where the audience comes to play. Same thing when we look at the audience. When we think about the audience, yes, obviously the audience is connected to the person who's communicating, but they're also connected to what's being said. And the same thing with the message. The message is connected to the person who's speaking, but also the person who's receiving it. So all of these are important factors for you to consider when you communicate. And too often we get that tunnel vision of only thinking about the words of our presentation and the information that we have to communicate. But what Aristotle tells us is that communication is a lot more complicated than that. And you'll see that the triangle here is fairly equal in terms of its angles, but rarely in real life is it equal, because it's always shifting and changing the dynamic of those relationships we have between all of those parts of communication. Okay, so we start there, but then he takes it up another level, and that's really where I'm going to be giving you these rhetorical tools. So this is what I'd like you to do next, is I'd like you to actually take some quick jot notes, because I'm going to put you to work in about 5 minutes. After I give you this quick crash course, I'm going to put you to work, and I'm going to get you to see if you can find these rhetorical tools in action, because that's where the magic happens. It's not just about learning the materials, it's about seeing them out in the wild, so to say. So let's talk about these tools that I just referred to before. Now, Aristotle, and that's a selfie, that's his latest selfie, Aristotle's selfie here, his little bust. He calls these the 3 modes of appeal. Now, when we say the word mode, all we really mean is tool. So these are basically 3 tools that I want you to think about when it comes to your communication. So for the lucky 5 of you that are here, and I'm so glad you're here, I'm going to put you to work, and Merle, you can help out too if you'd like. I'm going to put you to work. So look at the very first mode of appeal we have on the screen there. So that word is the word logos. Now that's actually a Greek word, and it's actually the Greek word for word. Logos means word. But what's interesting is if you look within that word logos, you can see the root of some English words that we use, especially when we think about argument. So look at the first 3 letters, L-O-G, and what word do you see embedded within there? And don't just say log, because I don't mean log. What words do you see? You can type it in the chat. You don't have to say it out loud. Logic, exactly it, Christine. Thank you. Logic. Yeah, logic. And so when you think logos, I want you to first think logic and think argument, and think that logos has to do with the logic, how you set up, how you deliver, the purpose of what you're saying. So it really is connected in large part back to that message component before, when we looked before at the components of the triangle. Logos really refers a lot to that message component, but it's not just the message itself. It's not just the message, it's how the message is communicated. So the evidence that you're using, the structure that you use, the format. We're going to talk a little bit about PowerPoint slides and what to do and what not to do with how you use PowerPoint slides. How you set up your slides is in itself a logos appeal, how easy it is to read, how attractive they are, how consistent they are, right? The evidence that you use in your presentation. I know this is all about research. So research is important, and that's an important part of your logos appeals, is the credibility of how you set up your argument, the proofs you use in your argument. This is a really important part of what it is you're communicating. And it's an easy sell, right? I can say logos, and most people are like, yeah, logos, no problem, right? Because especially if you're in a technical field, logos is really important. But notice that's just one of the 3 modes of appeal, right? Just like it's only one part of the triangle, you have to have all 3 of these parts of your argument in order for it to work. So that goes to the next one, pathos. This one gets to be a little bit more of a challenge. Look at pathos. Now look at the word here, P-A-T-H. Okay, now to those of you that take an RCM 300, hopefully you remember this. What's an English word that has P-A-T-H embedded within it? Anyone remember? Empathy. Christine's on a roll today. Way to go, Christine. You're exactly right, empathy. And when we talk about someone having empathy, what are we thinking about? When we say, I have empathy for you, what am I saying? I empathize. Well, what's that really bad cliche? I put myself in your shoes, right? And so like I relate to you. I know what that feels like. And that's pathos. But what that means for your argument means, it means how can I, the speaker, connect to you in the audience? That's pathos, is how can I make sure that you feel like I'm talking to you specifically? How do I make you feel like I'm directing my message to you? And pathos, that particular part of your argument, how you connect to your audience, is in large part how you communicate that logos, right? I like to think of pathos as the car that's driving around logos, right? If you don't have any good audience-centered strategies, if you don't make your audience care about your information, then your information will not be heard. It's just as simple as that. If you are bored giving me your information, then I will be bored receiving it, right? So you have to find ways to engage that audience interest. And one way that Aristotle says we can do that is through the use of emotion. Now, when I say that in a technical field, people look at me funny and say, Rebekah, there's nothing touchy and feely about engineering, right? I don't know. I think I've been in the college long enough. I've seen some touchy feely stuff. But that said, you can still connect to your audience, right? You can still use emotion. You can use enthusiasm, confidence, trust. All of those are legitimate professional emotions that you want your audience to feel in your presentation so that they buy into your idea, that they support your idea. You get the mark you want. You get the bid. You get the job that you're applying for. All this is rhetoric, but you have to connect to your audience. And so you must find ways to make your audience feel like you're talking to you specifically. Right? So you have to think about who it is you're speaking to. Think about their levels of interest, their levels of knowledge. All of this is really important. And a lot of times people disregard it. They think the only thing that's important is just the evidence. But like I said, if the evidence is not heard by your audience, if your audience doesn't care, if your audience doesn't understand, if your audience is angry or sad or upset, they're not going to pay attention. You have to connect to the people who are hearing your message. You have to. Okay, so find those ways to connect in a professional way and in an interesting way, because that's really what we remember the most are these pathos connections when we feel like someone's talking to us specifically. You don't look at your watch once, you don't scroll your phone once, because you're just connected to what they're saying. That's pathos, okay? Last but not least, ethos. Ethos. And so look at this word, ETH. There's no ETH word like by itself, right? ETH, embedded within that is the word ethics. Okay, so when you hear ethos, think ethics, think credibility, okay? And so before, pathos was connected in large part to audience. Ethos is largely connected to the speaker and the credibility of the speaker. Can I trust you? Can I trust what you're saying? And a big part of the research experience is that credibility. Do you have credible sources? Have you presented your information in a way that's credible for your audience to understand? Aristotle says we measure someone's credibility by seeing, do they have goodwill, good judgment, and ultimately good character? Can I trust you? And you can see how that's a foundational appeal. If I don't trust you, then I might question some of your facts. I might question some of your logos. If I don't trust you, then I might question that joke you told me, or I might question how you're trying to connect to me because I don't trust you. So you can see how all three of these are connected. And when one starts to kind of go off the rails, the others go off the rails. So when your logos appeals, let's say the evidence that you're using is lacking some credibility, well, then all of a sudden you're going to have issues with your ethos, which may in turn affect how you connect to your audience or pathos. If you ignore your audience and have no pathos, well, then you might not have your logos be understood. And then all of a sudden your credibility is questioned. So you can see that this is always a balancing act. All three of these are important parts of your message that you always have to consider, no matter how technical the information is. You need to have some measurement of all three. And like that triangle, they're rarely all equal in terms of emphasis. It depends on the situation you find yourself in, right? You might need to use a little bit more pathos in this one instance than logos, but all three, you should be able to find instances of all three. And the way that this shows up in your presentation is like this. So you first need to communicate your information in a way that's clear. That's where your logos comes into play. Making sure that that logos appeal is solid, it's strong, right? You've given your audience something to really hold on to. Next, your pathos appeal. So how do you connect to the audience? How do you get the audience to feel like I'm talking to you specifically? I'm not talking to any old audience, I'm talking to you. And the more your audience feels like you're talking to them, the more they're paying attention and the more likely it is they're going to act on what you're asking them to do. And then finally, how do you establish your own credibility? How do you make your audience trust you? Make your audience want to hear more of what it is you have to say. And you'll do that in large part by how you set up your argument. So that was a lot of talking, me talking. That was a lot. So any questions real quick before I put you to work? So I hope you have 3 columns by now. Okay, so you've got a logos column, and logos you've got evidence, purpose, format. In pathos, you've got audience connection, emotion, interesting, relevant. In ethos, you've got credibility, speaker, trustworthiness. Okay, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a quick video, and Merle's seen this video, and if you were at my last presentation, you saw it too, and it is my favorite. I love this video so much because it is hilarious. It is really funny. But what's great about this video is it's really illustrative of what we just talked about. This guy pretty much does everything wrong that you could do wrong in a presentation. So I want you to watch it, and I want you to look at these notes that you've been taking. And even if you're at home watching this after the fact, I want you to jot down, where does this guy go wrong? I could have showed this to you, this video to you 10 minutes ago, and you would have said this was a bad video. But now you'll be able to say it's a bad video because you know rhetoric now. And you'll be able to tell me why it's bad using rhetoric. Okay, so it's only about 3 minutes long. Watch it, and then we're going to do a quick debrief at the end. I will go back to sharing my screen here real quick. All right, here we go.
Quadruple checking notes as people file in, getting the computer ready, and asking everyone to take a seat. Pretending to click something on the computer to cover up the fact that I don't know what to do with myself.
Arriving just in time.
Wrapping up our conversation about a popular TV show we watched last night.
Disdain for popular TV show.
Mediocre icebreaker joke that doesn't quite land. Attempt to redeem myself by making fun of that guy.
Laughing at that guy.
Laughing because he's laughing. I like him.
Not laughing, and now checking out for the rest of the session.
Title, dramatic pause of my presentation.
Question about how long this session will last?
Annoyed, vague response.
Exaggerated eye roll.
Poignant quote from unknown philosopher to kick off presentation in dramatic fashion. Juvenile slide transition to spice things up. Reading a long paragraph exactly as it appears on the PowerPoint slide about a shocking statistic I just learned about, followed by all kinds of vague lingo that no one will remember 2 seconds from now, capped off by 3 bullet points. Proudly pause to make sure everyone notices my awesome clip art choice. Out of date pop culture reference.
Correction about pop culture reference.
Defending pop culture reference by citing social networking site no one uses.
Audible side to make sure everyone knows this is a complete waste of my time.
Serious and somewhat over the top reminder about how important this information is. Unexpected technical difficulty. Embarrassed people can see my desktop background.
Snide remark about how Macs are better than PCs.
Desperate plea for IT guy.
Fixing the problem with an annoyed look on my face so that everyone knows how good at computers I am.
Unfunny video I'm really proud of having created myself.
Texting my friend in a way that I think is discreet.
Clearly aware of the texting. Prefacing a preface of a preface so that no one really understands the point that I'm prefacing. And now, going through a long list of facts, one by one by one, asking if anyone has any questions. Reminding everyone there are no bad questions. Hoping if I wait long enough, someone will finally have a question. Concluding by restating the title of my presentation and dismissing everyone. Excited that someone came back for a follow-up conversation.
Grabbing pen that I accidentally left.
All right. So I love that last bit where it says communicate better. And isn't that the truth? Communicate better. So this is where I want to hear from you all. So I'm actually going to stop sharing for a second. So hopefully we can have a quick chat. What did you notice about his presentation of where he went wrong for rhetoric? So where did he go wrong in terms of his logos appeals, his pathos appeals, and his ethos appeals? I was going to make us do a quick shared Google Doc, but there's only a few of us here. So if you want to use the Google chat, or if you want to unmic yourself and we can just have a quick chat of things that you noticed of where he went wrong. Where did he go wrong? Any ideas? What stood out to you as a super egregious?
I didn't like his communication. I felt like he just right off the bat, you know, the whole I know everything and I'm here to present all my knowledge to you and you should be grateful sort of thing. It was, yeah.
So it sounds like you're describing his tone, Merle. Does that sound
yes,
right? Yeah.
that sounds.
Yeah,
And
his tone.
And Maya says he failed to connect with his audience, making inappropriate jokes.
Oh, for sure, for sure. Let's first get to your point about his tone. That tone is an unspoken quality. And what I like to tell my students is when we talk about tone, we're talking about someone's attitude. And we're talking about how they feel either towards what they're talking about, their subject, or about who they're talking to. And so when you hear that kind of intangible quality, what Merle was describing there, maybe you sensed it too. And almost like he was talking down to him, down to his audience. And when your audience feels that, your audience is not going to like that. I mean, think about the times that you felt that as an audience member, how that makes you not want to be on that person's side. And that would almost be a mistake of ethos, because that really has to do with his credibility, but also his pathos, right? But how he connects to his audience, you know, in terms of how he's relating to his audience. Maya's point here, he failed to connect to his audience, making inappropriate jokes. I'm really glad you brought that up, Maya. That one whole scene where he's like, and look at that guy, and everybody started laughing at him, right? It's interesting because at that moment, he probably felt that flush of embarrassment and he wanted to pass it off to someone else and so that he wouldn't feel embarrassed. Now, what's interesting is the audience laughed and he might tell himself, oh, they're on my side. But in that case, I don't think so. Right? In that case, the audience member, that's more of an uncomfortable kind of laugh, like, oh my goodness, I can't believe he just did that. And so when Maya says he failed to connect with his audience, that was a failure of pathos, right? Really, he failed to have that connection, that empathy connection, which in turn makes me question his logos and his ethos, right? And it makes him just fail all around the board. You know, we could spend the rest of our time together right now talking about the many ways that this poor man failed with his communication. But he really failed because he wasn't finding that balance. He wasn't finding the best way to communicate his message to his audience in a way that they wanted to hear it, because that's a really big lesson when we communicate. It's not always what I want to say, but it's what does my audience need to hear from me? And that's going to change. It's going to change the way you set up your presentation when you put your audience as the priority, right? And as a result, he really lost a lot of credibility. And we're going to talk about some of the mistakes he made with his PowerPoint. My favorite one is when he uses PowerPoint as that prompt, and then all of a sudden he gets surprised. So that leads me to my slides. Let's go back to my slides then. Let's talk a bit more. Merle, Maria, you say something.
Maria also said he made the audience feel uncomfortable. Like, yeah, absolutely. And all of these things that we've just been talking about, you've nailed it, Maria. Absolutely.
Oh, no, for sure. And you don't want your audience uncomfortable, right? You don't. And we're going to talk about that. I'm going to tell you my number one secret that I always tell all my public speaking students that has to do with your audience. But you want your audience on your side. And your audience starts with you on your side. But you have to hold on to that connection. That's your responsibility as a speaker. But yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, Merle, because for sure that definitely was a big, big mistake on his part. All right, back to our slides here then. Okay, so when it comes to using PowerPoint, I find that people tend to use it in three ways. So they'll use it as the fake word slidument, which is not an actual word, but it just means slide document, which means people just write too much, way too much on their slides. They treat their slides like it's a Microsoft Word page and not like a presentation device, which we'll get to in just a moment. And there's that teleprompter that I told you about just a moment ago. Teleprompters are where you're reading the slides almost like they're your script. And that's why that's one of my favorite scenes in that video is when he gets that forgotten point where it's like, oh, I forgot about that. You can see how that could really destroy your credibility if you're not careful. So we're going to talk about how to get past some of these mistakes that he made, especially in terms of his delivery. And a lot of that has to do with practice. But in a large part, some of the mistakes he made initially, at least when it came to his presentation, had to do with how he considered PowerPoint. And I would argue he was seeing PowerPoint as that slide you meant or teleprompter, but he didn't see it as that third point, which is presentation. And that's what PowerPoint's meant to be. It's a visual medium. It's meant to help you convey information quickly. So you have to know how to use it, and not everyone knows how to use it. I found one stat once that said up to 300 million PowerPoint presentations are made every single day around the world. That's a lot of PowerPoint presentations. And I would argue probably 299.9% of them are not good because people don't know how to use PowerPoint. And maybe you've had that experience in your class where you've been with an instructor who clearly did not know how to use PowerPoint in the way that was the most effective. And so one way for you to think about how to use PowerPoint effectively is to think of these tools that we've already been talking about, in addition to some of these tips that I'm going to be giving you right now. Here's some quick 5 tips that came from a book I read all about creating effective PowerPoint presentations. And the book itself was actually written on PowerPoint, so it's a very visual book in terms of how it's set up. But Nancy Duarte is a communication specialist, and she says that these are 5 things for you to think about when it comes to setting up your own PowerPoint presentation. And some of these are pretty obvious, right? Obviously, you want to tell the truth. That goes to your ethos. You want to have that credibility. You want to make sure you're presenting the best information for the people who are receiving it. You want to get to the point. You don't want to waste anyone's time. In order to do that, you have to pick the right tool that highlights what's important while still keeping it simple. Now notice that all 5 of these you could quickly scan through and read through on your own before I said anything within anywhere between 5 to 10 seconds. And that's the rule you want to go for when it comes to your slides, especially if you're going to flash them up on the screen, is you don't want to give your audience too much to read at once. Because otherwise this happens. I'm going to tell you right now not to read the slide, but I know everyone's reading the slide, even though I'm telling you not to read it. You're good little robots. Yeah, see Merle's reading it, even though I told her not to, right? And the reason why is we're visual animals. Like, yes, we're human beings, but we're also animals. And when we see something flashy on the screen, we're going to read it. Now, what people don't realize is when we read a slide, reading is a verbal activity, just like speaking is a verbal activity. And so when you're reading, oftentimes people will have a reading voice in their head. I know I have one when I read. And so when I'm reading this page, I'm not able to hear you because I'm hearing myself read these words. And so that's what happens when you have a ton of text on a slide, is it becomes a race to read. And so who's going to win? Is it going to be the person reading it out loud or the person reading to themselves? The person reading to themselves. And they're going to be wondering, tick, 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 what's taking so long? Why aren't you reading? Why are you reading faster? And you will never win that race. And if anything, you will always lose because you will make your audience really bored. And you're not going to be able to explain because they won't be able to hear what you're saying because they're too busy reading all these points. So you don't want to do that. So what do you want to do instead? Well, you want to use bullets, right? You want to use bullets. And again, bullets are meant to be these headlines that keeps information to the point, but you want it to be consistent enough so that you're drawing the audience, you're highlighting those key phrases, those key thoughts that you want your audience to take away with them. Now, if you ever have to have a bunch of information on a slide, you want to be careful with how you show it. You don't want to just throw it all up at one time because then you get this, and no one wants to read that. There's ways to stagger it. There's ways to have different slides, but you also want to have a reason for how you use PowerPoint because you want to use it well. You don't want to just throw it out there and hope something sticks. You really want to use it with a purpose in mind when you're putting it together. So to do that, you sometimes have to have the right visual for the job. And so I really like this. Oh, Merle, you look like you were going to say something. Oh, you're good. Okay, I thought you were about to wave at me. When you look at these 2 graphics up here, both of these graphics say the same thing, but notice how they're both very different with how they convey information to you visually. Okay, so the one on the left is the table. Now that is an excellent way to convey information in a written report. Why? Because I can take the time to trace and think about and find those numbers and those factors really quickly. But you could theoretically explain a table in a presentation, right? But notice how long it's going to take for me to explain that table versus the bar graph where boom, right away, I'm able to highlight what I wanted to highlight. And that instance is because I picked the right medium for the job. So you have to ask yourself that question. What you're putting together for your report might not translate well for the PowerPoint. You might have to change it up a bit. You might have to think about that presentation medium of it all and not have that beautiful paragraph from your paper, but instead maybe a flow chart or maybe a graphic that you could explain, because you recognize the medium calls for you to use it differently than you would just a paper. Okay. So you have to adapt it. You have to adapt it because that's your responsibility. That's your rhetorical responsibility, is to think, this is my logos. This is the information I have. How can I use some pathos and some ethos to make sure that I'm communicating in a way that's the most effective? Before we get to that though, I know we don't have a ton of people here, but I thought I would just throw it open for questions real quick for those of you that are here. The next part of my presentation is going to be all about delivery. But I kind of wanted, last time I gave this presentation, we had some good chat and some good questions about slides and putting together things for PowerPoint. And I only really kind of hit the high points because I kind of wanted just to give you something to think about. So I don't know, Merle, if you have a question, or if anyone who's here, you want to use the chat to write a question if you have a question about using PowerPoint. But I thought we could use the next couple minutes here, just kind of check in to see how y'all are doing. Any questions or comments about PowerPoint that I could help you out with?
One of the things that I've done, sorry, did I interrupt somebody?
I don't think so.
Okay. One of the things that I've done in PowerPoint when I'm giving presentations, particularly to an international audience, if I'm at an international conference, is that because I'm a historian, I use a lot of pictures. And so I find that the PowerPoint, what I do is that I'll go over my presentation, 15 minutes and make sure that I've got that really, really tight. And then I'll set my PowerPoint to just run in the background, and the slides will just change on their own, and then I'm not going back and forth and hitting go and so on and so forth. The one downside is that it doesn't allow you to have that back and forth with the audience, but it does allow you to give your presentation, and that it actually leaves better time at the end, for that back and forth when your presentation's done. So I don't know if that's a suggestion, but I have done it, and to do the pre-recorded timings on it so that it just flips in the background really nicely, and I've done that, and it's quite effective. But you do need to stay on task with whatever you're saying.
That's interesting. I like that. I've never heard of that before. I think that's a really interesting strategy, especially for a conference. I could see that being really useful for that kind of presentation for sure.
Yeah. And then it's one less thing for me to be worrying about, always hitting, making sure that, and then turning around, looking at your screen, you just trust that it's going to be there, and away you go. So yeah,
it's great. One other tip that I like to give students is something called parachute points. So we all know what a parachute is, right? We have parachutes just in case, right? But we don't want to use them, but they're there to make us feel better, And so what a parachute point is in a speech is what I like to say is a spare point or an interesting observation or something extra, a nice to know point that doesn't have to be in your presentation. So it's not a need to know, it's a nice to know. But what's nice about having these parachute points is if you find yourself in a presentation where you're running short on time and you need to fill in some spaces, having these parachute points are always really interesting because they really liven up your audience. They get your audience awake. They're interesting, but they also help you to expand your time and help you to really fill up the time that you have. And so when you're first starting your presentations, oftentimes people will find that they're often short because when you're nervous, you don't say as much as you would like. And so it's often a good strategy to have a couple of these parachute points on your notes, just in case, so you can kind of flesh out more of your slides if you ever need to do that. And I'm very much a worst case scenario girl, so it's always nice to kind of have that too, just as your own, for your own benefit.
Do you have recommendations, Rebekah, in terms of like how many points per slide, or that kind of thing? Like, are there any guidelines or rules or places where we can go to read about that?
Yeah. I have to do some research to see if there's any hard and fast rules. Like I think the main rule that I've seen, it really has to do with that 5 to 10 seconds reading to quickly scan. And so I don't think there's necessarily any number of points per se, but I'll get to that one second, Maya. I think just recognizing the cognitive load that your audience has. And so like some slides may take longer than others, and you recognize that. So like if you're gonna show me a slide with a big schematic on it, I'm not gonna know that in 10 seconds. But what that's gonna require you to do is you're gonna have to explain it. You're gonna have to pull out parts of that complicated, you know, and you're going to find ways to make it explainable to me quickly. So if you recognize that there's parts of your presentation that might be a little bit harder for your audience to process, then that's a good signal to you to break it up a little bit more, because recognize when you give a presentation, the first time you give it, they need to be able to understand it. And so sometimes that requires you to break things into smaller units, and so that you're not overloading them so much that they just turn off. Because we've all been in classes before where profs have put too much on a slide and you're just too tired and it's a pandemic and I don't want to hear this, and you just start thinking about your grocery list, right? So you don't want to give your audience that permission. You want to make it interesting and engaging enough for them that they're always tracking with you. And sometimes that means slowing down a little bit and letting them catch up. So Maya's question here, parachute points aren't necessarily on the slides because you don't know if you need to use them. But sometimes, like if you're doing notes, you know, sometimes you can do notes where you can have it on the side, and you might have a couple of those just kind of on the margin on the side, or maybe on the back of your card, so that just in case, you know, oh, I've got this story that I can tell just in case. Does that make sense, Maya? Okay. All right, well, I want to just wrap up the last bit of our presentation here, talking a little bit about nerves, because nerves are a big part of presentations. And I want to give you some strategies that I hope will help when it comes to dealing with some of these nerves. So here we go. So the first big advice that I have to you when it comes to making yourself feel better about feeling nervous is to practice. And I know that I'm one of those annoying teachers, but it's true. The more you practice, the more confident you become, the more comfortable you are with your materials. So really taking that time to practice, and you want to practice in the right kind of way. And what I mean by that is, don't be like me thinking, oh, I'm going to sit back on my couch back there and I'm going to practice my speech in my head, right? Because I'm going to sit back here and I'm just going to think about it. Because like, if you're like me, when I think about my speech, I'm just like brilliant in my head. Like I'm Barack Obama up here. Like I am just flawless and I am smooth. But then somehow when I actually speak out loud, there's some kind of disconnect, right? And so when you practice it, you want to practice it out loud because you want to practice what it feels like to say these words. And if you're going to be stumbling, it's better for you to stumble at home in your kitchen in your socks than it is in front of an audience, right? So practice saying things out loud so you get comfortable with it. Practice with a timer, practice with your slides, practice what it means to give a presentation. Right now we're in this weird COVID world, right? Where it's, you know, it's a little bit harder to navigate some of these technology issues. You might want to just have some friends and say, you know what, let's have a Zoom party night and I'm going to give you my presentation and they can hear your presentation. But the more practice you can give yourself, the more likely it is you're going to feel better about the presentation because you're going to have that confidence. That said, there is such thing as too much practice. Okay, so practice, but don't over practice. And what I mean by that is don't practice it so much that you end up memorizing it, because memorizing, we all know what it sounds like to have someone give us a memorized pitch. I mean, think of the last time you picked up your phone and you heard a telemarketer trying to sell you something. They're not actually talking to you because they've memorized a script, and they're not really interesting to talk to because they're not actually talking to you, they're talking at you. So you want to have a conversational kind of quality to your presentation, but you don't want to memorize it because memorizing it will really fall flat for your audience. So I always like to recommend having a set of outline notes that you can just practice giving your presentation to your audience. And the two factors I have here are both visual and vocal delivery things for you to think about. So visually, how are you coming across on camera? How are you coming across in person? And there's different constraints for each. You know, if you're giving a presentation via video, then you want to make sure you've got a good camera angle. You want to make sure you've got okay lighting. It's not going to be too crazy, the background behind you. You want to make sure your crazy cat's not going to jump in front of your camera. Mine's not in the room right now. You know, you want to take care of what you can take care of. If you can control your environment so you feel confident. You know, you might want to tell your little sister to not come into your room if you're giving a presentation because you don't want to have that in the background. There's different techniques and devices you can use for the platform, so you can blur out the background if you don't want people to see your background, right? But fine, you don't want to give anyone a distraction to what it is you're communicating. And that's just for video conferences. When you're actually facing someone, you want to think about how you use your hands. You want to think about how you stand, how confident you look. You want to think of all these different factors of what you look like when you give that presentation. You want to feel confident, right? You want to feel confident. I'm not saying go out and spend tons of money on clothes, but wear something that you feel good in. Wear something that you feel like you look the part. You want people to look at you and take you seriously. And that all has to do with your visual delivery. Recognize anything you do with your body, your audience will perceive that as information. So you don't want to do anything crazy like waving your hands around like this, because then your audience will see that instead of seeing you. So you really want anything you do with yourself visually to enhance your message, not take away from it. Same thing works vocally. You want to make sure you have that strong vocal presence in addition to your visual presence. So you aren't speaking too quickly. You're trying not to use too many speech tags, things like and If you've got a couple of those, that's fine. But if every other word is an chances are people will be counting those instead of counting your points, and you don't want that. Because often when we have these types of speech tags, people could perceive that as a lack of confidence, and you don't want that. You don't want that. Having the practice there will hopefully help to get rid of some of those. The best advice I could give you is to not call attention to your nerves, to not apologize for them, to not start your speech by saying, I'm so scared, my face is so red, I'm so sorry. Don't do that. Don't do that. Because the number one secret I always tell my students that I hope you will remember, forget everything else, but remember this, your audience is on your side. The audience wants to see you do well. They want to see you succeed. And so you just give it your best shot and try not to apologize or call attention to the fact that your body does weird things when you're nervous, because everyone has weird things that our body does. You don't want to call attention to it, because then you give me permission to pay attention to your red face and not pay attention to your point. And you want me to pay attention to your point. So just do your best, do your best. And if you come to your presentation, putting the time and effort into your argument and putting the time and effort into your presentation in terms of your delivery, you're going to do okay. You're going to do okay. Wrapping things up here. Quick summary is I always want you to remember those 3 modes of appeal. And so remember, it's more than just the info. It's also the connection. It's also the credibility. You have to have all 3 of those in order to be a successful argument. Because when you only rely on one and you forget those other 2, then that's when the problems happen. So you want to try your best to consider all 3 of those in some kind of measure anytime you communicate. Try your best to involve your audience. Those are the best kind of presentations, the ones when I can tell the person who's giving me the talk is excited and enthusiastic and passionate about their research. Show that to your audience. Don't be afraid to show us a little glimpse of yourself, because sometimes that little glimpse of yourself makes all the difference. And then finally, practice, practice, practice. I can't emphasize that enough. Practice with an outline and trust yourself. Trust yourself to be able to communicate your information that you've worked so hard to put together for your audience, because I know that you all are working so hard on your projects, and you want to make sure that your products are heard and understood by the audience who hears them. Okay. Last but not least, it's always good to end on a high note. So if you have questions, I'm more than happy to answer your questions. For those of you that are here, if those of you are watching after the fact, I hope Merle, whenever she posts this, feel free to post my contact information, because I'm always happy to chat with students, because this definitely is something that I am really passionate about. So thank you so much for this opportunity. And if anyone has any questions or comments, I'm more than happy to take them at this time.
Well, if the students, I'm sure that the students will come in, and the students know me well enough to know that they'll be able to pop in with their questions on the chat anytime. But I am curious to know, Rebekah, is that the logos, pathos, and ethos, when we put that into something that we're writing, let's say for a class, let's say that we're taking a biology class over here and we're taking a sociology class over there. It's 2 completely different modes of communication. Does that apply no matter what discipline it is, or do you find that that's sort of more specific for one discipline over another? And how do we pitch things properly depending on what discipline we're working in?
Well, that's not an easy question, Merle. Thanks a lot.
Sorry.
I mean, the short answer is, what's great about rhetoric is that it is pretty universal. Like it's these tools will work anywhere, right? Because whatever discipline you're in, you're going to have your own logos associated with that discipline, right? So I come from a more humanities discipline, but that doesn't mean I don't have logos. It just means my logos might be different than my colleague who's a civil engineer. Right? So each field has its own type of logos, but we all have audiences we have to appeal to, right? And so that's really where the magic happens in rhetoric, I think, is rhetoric reminds us that we're not talking to robots, we're talking to human beings, and we have to do our best to make sure we're understood by our human beings. And so Merle's point earlier about the speaker and how the speaker alienated the audience, and I think that was I think Maya made that point too about how he made fun of the audience. That person wasn't thinking about how the human beings were going to interpret what he did there. He wasn't thinking of the implications of his speech. And so that's what rhetoric tells us, is rhetoric tells us that we always have to think of our audience. And no matter where we are, no matter if I'm biology or sociology or wherever I'm at, is I always have to think, how can I make this relevant and important to my audience while still holding on to my own credibility and the information that I want to convey? So it pretty much is across the board. It's the closest thing I come to a one size fits all. But what's great about rhetoric is it allows you to tweak and adjust and make it work for wherever you find yourself. So like I said before, whether it's writing a research report or getting your roommate to finally do the dishes, we can use rhetoric to help you find that right balance to make sure your argument works. Hope that answered your question. The short yes.
No, it was very good. It is something that comes up every once in a while. People, especially when you're an undergraduate student, you're taking classes right across the board, sort of thing. So, you think you've learned all the skills that you need to get a good mark in your English class, and yet you turn around and you're trying to do an environmental science report, and things are all kind of upside down. So you end up trying to figure out how to use these communication skills in so many different disciplines, but.
And what you're doing there, Merle, you're describing pathos, right? As you're describing, as a speaker, I have to learn to adjust to all these different audiences. And so my biology prof will have different standards than my English prof, than my rhetoric prof, right? And so you're already doing rhetoric. We already do it. We just don't realize we're doing it. Is we don't realize we're always adjusting. So that's a really good point. I'm glad you brought that up, because it just kind of shows that this goes across the board. It doesn't have to be only for one class or for one course. Thanks for bringing that up.
Thanks for answering it. Any questions from our audience today? It's a quiet crew.
That's all right. It's good. Well, thanks so much for inviting me over. I really do appreciate this. I do want to put in a quick plug for the Writing Center, just because I primarily deal with a lot of spoken communication, but I know the Writing Center on campus is also really great for providing extra resources and help for that. So for sure, check them out.
They absolutely are, and I do want to reiterate that. So that they're prepared to help no matter what your particular writing project is in. Going back to my disciplinary question, what the Writing Center will do is that they have a number of tutors, and they each have different backgrounds. So they have tutors that are really good in biology and chemistry. They've got tutors who are good across the board, and so they'll be able to give you feedback on whatever it is that you're writing, no matter what discipline it's in. So don't just think that the Writing Center is only for your English class.
Totally.
It's absolutely not. It's for anything that you might have to produce across campus, including CVs and resumes, if it's CV and resume season for you. So think about that as well.
For sure.
Thank you very much, Rebekah. I'm going to end the recording, and if there's more questions, we can